Like any good detective story, this one begins with a death. The bitter cold of a winter morning, a silent airfield. A man climbs into the cockpit of a prototype fighter, unaware it will be his final flight. The Soviet newspapers mourned. Heroic pilot Valery Chkalov gave his life for the supremacy of Soviet aviation. Just a year earlier, this man had become the most famous non-American pilot in the USA, a national sensation who captured the imagination of millions. He was celebrated worldwide. But behind the parades and smiles, Chkalov had unwillingly implemented Stalin's audacious plan to conquer America. This isn't a conspiracy theory, but a real story from 1937. One team of heroic pilots, one remarkable airplane, and one daring flight brought Stalin's country to the top of the world. December 15, 1938. Valery Chkalov, official Soviet aviator number 1, a hero of Soviet Union and professional test pilot, arrived at the airfield. A man who had completed more than 800 test flights was to pilot the Polycarpov I-180 fighter prototype for the first time. A routine flight, a brief program, flying circles at 600 meters altitude with the landing gear left down. But the disaster struck. The engine failed in freezing temperatures and Chkalov lost his life in the crash. Soviet officials loudly claimed it a tragic accident, but the others whispered that this was a well-planned political assassination. Not the evidence, but the sequence of events proved them right. Over the time, the crash became shrouded in mystery, buried under layers of half-truth and conspiracy. Some rumors were wild. Others felt disturbingly plausible. The more you look into them, the more you see that they were expertly created in Soviet state security institutions. They are aimed at making you confused. To understand what really happened, we have to rewind to the spring of 1936. That spring, 3 Soviet pilots accompanied by senior officials stepped into Stalin's office. They came with a proposal as bold as it was dangerous. A Transpolar flight from the Soviet Union over the North Pole to the United States. Test pilot Valery Chkalov was confident in success. Soviet long-range ANT-25 aircraft was more than capable of making the journey. Stalin, however, was not so optimistic. Just a year earlier, in 1935, another ANT-25 crew had attempted a similar mission. It was widely announced in the Soviet press, but it ended in disappointment when an oil leak forced them to land after only 2,000 kilometers. Stalin hadn't forgotten. He didn't want another failure. The stakes were too high. Still, he supported the idea under certain conditions. Before flying over the pole, the crew had to prove the airplane could handle the distance on a long-range mission within Soviet borders. July 20, 1936. The crew succeeded. They completed a grueling 9,375-kilometer flight across the Soviet territory, landing safely on Ud Island deep in the Sea of Okhotsk. It was a triumph. To mark it with symbolism, the words Stalin's Route were painted in bold red on both sides of the fuselage. Those words were meant for the next, much riskier mission through the Arctic to America. And Stalin, he was watching, and he was pleased. His plan began to come true. On May 25, 1937, a decree from the Politburo made it official. Chkalov, Baidukov and Belakov aboard the ANT-25 would attempt a non-stop Transpolar flight from Moscow to San Francisco. It was to be the longest flight ever made. The goal was to shatter the world record held by the French. Preparations were immediate and intense. The plane was stripped of non-essentials. Every kilogram mattered. The aircraft was equipped with the most advanced gear, an aviation horizon, a gyromagnetic compass, a solar course indicator, and much more. A sun compass was essential, because the magnetic one was unreliable near the pole. The onboard radio could transmit messages up to 5,000 kilometers away and allowed ground stations to track the aircraft within a 2,000-kilometer radius. To protect the crew from the brutal cold, the heat from the engine was pumped through the pipes placed inside the cabin. The fuel caps were sealed, literally, to silence any critics who might question the flight's legitimacy. The ANT-25, or the RD, which stands for Distance Record, was particularly designed for the long-range flights. Developed in July 1932 by the Tupolev Design Bureau, it wasn't actually Tupolev's creation. The aeroplane was developed by the Pavel Sukhoi Brigade. It was the first time when a student outshone his mentor. This would happen again in the 1960s, when Sukhoi would build the T-4 Sotka heavy bomber. It was to become the Soviet Valkyrie, but it's entirely another story. By the way, it's still the most viewed video on the channel. In 1934, the ANT-25 passed its flight test under the command of Mikhail Gromov. Fuel consumption calculations revealed the aircraft's remarkable range of 13,000 kilometers. Gromov took it on several daring long-haul flights across the Soviet Union, distances even greater than the route Chkalov would eventually attempt. Keep his name in mind, he will play his part in this story. The flight was long, dangerous, and expensive. The risks were enormous. The ground support was unprecedented. All Soviet ships, including icebreakers and Arctic radio stations, were put on alert. Every kilometer of the sky was monitored. Why would the Soviets make so much effort? Why was this flight so important? On the morning of June 18, 1937, 3 men boarded the airplane. Chkalov as a commander, Baidukov as a relief pilot, and Belakov as a navigator and radio operator departed from Sholkovo airfield near Moscow. What followed was a 63-hour gauntlet of human endurance. The cockpit was freezing cold. The engine was overheating. Oxygen deprivation made all this even harder. Over the pole, they faced storms, icing, and sheer isolation, which created severe psychological burden. Baidukov eventually took control in the last hours as Chkalov bled from the nose due to hypoxia. On the 20th of June 1937, after covering some 8,800 kilometers, the crew landed at Pearson Airfield, Vancouver, Washington. The Soviet pilots were received like true heroes in the US. When Chkalov and crew landed, they were welcomed with a 19-gun salute. New suits from Meyer and Frank store and the best hotel rooms were waiting for them. They toured the country, received a ticker tape parade in New York, and met face-to-face with President Roosevelt in White House. Chkalov's feat was a rare moment of inspiration for the American public hit by unemployment and economic instability. This was the brief triumph the nation desperately needed. Chkalov became America's most renowned Soviet pilot for pioneering long-distance Arctic flight. The press hailed him as the Russian Limburg. Simple and open-hearted, he was warmly welcomed by common people. His speeches fascinated everyone, without a single word in English. The pilots were heroes beyond a shadow of a doubt, but the whole flight was a failure. They did not break the world record. They did not reach their target. It was supposed to be a non-stop flight from Moscow to San Francisco. They were forced to land in Vancouver due to the lack of fuel. Those details were conveniently ignored. Without realizing it, the pilots have become pawns in a colossal political game. It began in 1933 with the opening of the Soviet embassy in the United States. Then came the 1936 Soviet Industrial Exhibition in New York, a massive showcase of technological advancement. The same year, the Soviet Peace Campaign, praising the USSR's rapid progress and peaceful intent. The Tupolev flight was the icing on this cake of propaganda. A dramatic aviation feat presented Stalin's country as the symbol of progress, technological mastery, and international friendship. It boosted Soviet prestige at home and abroad. And while the world applauded, no one looked too closely at what lay behind the performance. However, the real life in the USSR was too horrifying to believe in. The period of Soviet history from 1936 to 1938 is known as the Great Purge, a campaign of mass repression, arrests, and executions led by Stalin and carried out by the NKVD. Government officials, military leaders, intellectuals, artists, farmers, and ordinary citizens were all targeted. So-called national operations affected every nation of the USSR. In the course of 15 months, over 1.7 million people were arrested on political charges. More than 680,000 were executed by the NKVD. And that's just the official count. Forced confessions, tortures, and much more cannot be counted. It was one of the darkest periods of Stalin's rule. The world marveled at Soviet airplanes, while the happiest people of socialist country vanished into prison camps. There are many theories as to why Stalin pursued this policy. One of them was that he was preparing for the war, the big war the USSR was going to win. That's why he needed absolute power, developed industry, and obedient society. Complete secrecy was heavily guarded by all those celebrated Soviet accomplishments. However, the feast in America looked like a well-organized diplomatic spectacle for a domestic audience, and not a cheap one. The Great Depression had not yet ended. Who would ever need this in the US? Back in the early 1930s, Stalin was pushing through his first 5-year industrialization plan. Ironically, most of the factories shaping the Soviet dream were built by American corporations, the very capitalists Stalin claimed to fight against. When the Americans arrived in the USSR, they were shocked to witness the real builders of Soviet industry. These factories were constructed by political prisoners, men and women who were forced to work in brutal gulag camps under inhuman conditions. Moral dilemma was tough, but the Great Depression demanded drastic measures. Still, no one wanted to lose their face at home. Since most newspapers were controlled by businesses, it was uncommon to bring this up in the United States. American companies were eager to trade with the Soviet Union, but they needed a good cause, and there it was. It's quite plausible that the US president's meeting with Chkalev's crew was partly driven by the interests of American businesses. The American press embraced the pilots as symbols of modern heroism, with minimal discussion of Soviet home politics. For an informed public, the USSR seemed rather mysterious than hostile and dangerous, impressive but not threatening. Few isolated articles about the horrors in the USSR resulted in doubts. This could not be true. Facts must be exaggerated. Yet it was not enough for Stalin's victory. From July 12 to 14, 1937, Mikhail Gromov pushed the Ant-25 even further, flying non-stop from Moscow to San Jacinto, California, shattering the world record with 10,148 kilometers. Gromov became the Soviet Union's unofficial pilot number 1. Still, it was Chkalov who captured the hearts of both Soviet and American people. But his flight was no less important in Stalin's game. The cold calculation, without a shade of emotion. 10 days earlier, on July 2, 1937, Amelia Earhart vanished during her attempt to circumnavigate the globe. The massive rescue effort that followed ended in heartbreaking mystery. It was a harsh reminder of aviation's dangers, the fragility beneath its glamour. The press didn't shy away from the ill-timed comparison. While Americans mourned Earhart, the Soviets had pulled off a high-stakes Arctic flight successfully, twice. Both Republican and Democratic papers discussed political undertones. Soviet technology was proving strong and reliable, while American aviation seemed vulnerable, especially after a string of domestic mail airplane crashes and navigation failures. The politicians believed that revealing the problem was the best way to find a solution. But it was only getting worse. The Americans made Stalin's dream come true. They created a superpower out of the USSR with their own hands. Until the very beginning of the Cold War, many in the US saw the Soviet Union as a significant global player with a developed industry and a valuable ally. Beneath the propaganda, the USSR was a backward, aggressive state, and its progress was a fragile illusion. Stalin's forced collectivization had devastated Soviet agriculture. On the planned economy, the industry was effective only in the military sphere. But it would not be true victory if Stalin received nothing more than recognition. The United States and the USSR established a commercial agreement that went into effect on August 6, 1937. The agreement granted the USSR most favored nation treatment for imports and exports from the US, in exchange for the Soviet government's commitment to significantly increase the purchases of American products. The Soviets, who sold mostly wood and wheat, gained access to strategic materials and new technologies. They imported steel, aviation aluminum, oil, and much more. Officially, they were needed to make cars and tractors, to develop civil aviation. In fact, the Soviets were building trucks instead of cars, bombers and fighters instead of civilian airplanes. And guess who had the largest tank fleet by 1941? American equipment helped increase Soviet oil production greatly, so the USSR kept selling it to Germany until the end of 1940. This was the real face of the Soviet peace campaign. It's hard to say if the American economy desperately needed Soviet money, but having another superpower as an ally was priceless. The treaty was not cancelled when the Soviets and Germans divided Poland in September 1939. When in November the USSR attacked Finland, the American government gave some support to Finns and unsuccessfully tried to make a peace deal with the Soviets. A so-called moral embargo was placed on certain goods, but neither morals nor embargoes were what made the difference. It was Finnish battlefield successes and the British threat to bomb the oil fields in the Caucasus that forced Stalin to stop. And now imagine if someone famous in the US revealed unpleasant truth about the most prominent socialist country. No, Chkalov was no dissident, a loyal communist to the core. Colleagues remembered him as bold, self-sacrificing, obedient to authority. A man of action, ready to risk his life for the sake of aviation. His dangerous maneuvers, initially criticized, proved to be highly effective in the dogfight during World War II. Yet stories about scandals, rebellion, or drunkenness have little or no proof. Most of them are not even worth mentioning, but two rumors are really absurd. The first one is that Stalin called Chkalov to his office to offer the position of the head of the NKVD. Chkalov refused in a rude manner, and after a short verbal skirmish, Chkalov left. Stalin called him the next morning, apologized, and invited to come to his office to settle things down. Really? Dropping Stalin's post during the demonstration could result in a 10-year prison sentence. But another rumor is totally wild. It suggests that during a high-rank meeting in Stalin's office, Chkalov stood up and went to the table with refreshments. There, he poured 2 big glasses of vodka and offered Stalin a drink in front of everyone, trying to humiliate him. When Stalin refused, he drank 1 glass and simply left. All those rumors are just aimed at corrupting the pilot's image. After his American triumph, Chkalov received the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union and a PO-2 airplane as a gift. On the 12th of December 1937, the pilot was elected a deputy of the Council of Nationalities of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR from the remote Gorkov region and the Chuvash ASSR. Nominal position to keep the Soviet legend nearby. No one expected him to actually go there. Everything was accounted. Long distance and terrible roads would never let him make actual visits. However, Chkalov took it seriously. Since he could not use muddy roads, he used his PO-2 to travel there. He talked to locals, saw the terror with his own eyes. How could so many loyal communists turn into enemies overnight? Unbelievable. Why so many arrests, so many disappearances? He had permanent conflicts with local NKVD officials who asked him not to intervene. His letters in defense of those arrested were turning into a disturbing signal for Stalin. Besides, the articles criticizing Soviet internal politics started appearing in the Western press more often. Chkalov was a man of action, but Stalin needed an icon. And being a test pilot was highly dangerous. A year after he became a deputy, a disaster struck. The investigation was fast and secret. 2 chief flight organizers were arrested immediately. They would later be acquitted, posthumously. Officially, engine failure caused the crash. The death of Russian Limburg was not covered by the American press. In the USSR, Chkalov remained a hero, a silent hero. In 1975, a monument was unveiled in Vancouver, Washington. just across the field where Chkalov once landed. Americans valued pioneering Arctic more than Stalin's intrigues. After the Transpolar flights, Stalin ordered the An-25 to be converted into a bomber and a strategic reconnaissance aircraft. Two ambitious projects resulted in two complete failures. It seemed as if the airplane itself was against it. It wanted to be remembered as an Arctic pioneer and a record breaker.